Hi everybody, I'm Howard Wetsman. I'm an addiction psychiatrist here in New Orleans, and I got this satellite seminar so that I could show how we built a addiction treatment business and solved a number of different problems that came up in that business, both clinical, organizational, financial, with insurance, etc., using an old management technique from the 80s called theory of constraints. And so to do that, I want to start with the end, but not the end of the story of our treatment center, but an end, really, this guy's end. His name is Eliyahu Goldratt, and he is the physicist who described and invented the theory of constraints. He lived in Israel. He was asked by his government back in the 70s to please go into a manufacturing plant and help them out. And he was a physicist, and he said, what do you want me to do? I'm a physicist. And they said, please just do your best. So he went in and he said, people in the plant didn't act the same way that he thought they would act if they were, as he said, scientists from a precision science. And so he took a different view of things. He took a physicist's view of the manufacturing plant and actually was able to turn things around with no cost within just a month and make amazing changes to the plant, which had been failing. And he took his notes and he started teaching this method, going around consulting, helping businesses turn things around. And then as he began to describe his methods more and more people from more and more fields started to use these. They've been used in finance, marketing, interpersonal relations, organizational behavior, all kinds of different applications. But to my knowledge, no one had used them in clinical medicine before. But this is what really attracted me to Goldratt's theory. This is his grave, and the reason I'm showing you that is because on that bottom stone is a quote. This is from one of Goldratt's writings, and it's the six points of his manifesto. 1, people are good. 2, every conflict can be removed. 3, every situation, no matter how complex it initially looks, is exceedingly simple. 4, every situation can be substantially improved. Even the sky is not the limit. 5, every person can reach a full life. 6, there's always a win-win solution. This is such an amazingly positive outlook on life that it borders on the Pollyannish. And people could look at it and say, wow, this guy's got his head in the clouds. But really, he was an incredibly practical person. And this is not a philosophy he imposed on other people. It's the philosophy he developed while watching the positive results from watching people work. And when I started reading Goldratt, and particularly when I saw this quote, I immediately thought of the patients that we were treating with addiction, because so often people weren't looking for a win-win solution, and so often people weren't assuming that people are good, and so often people were faced with incredibly complex problems, or believing they were faced with incredibly complex problems, which actually, when you knew how to handle you knew how to use his techniques, were exceedingly simple. He wrote a book called The Goal. Now, this is not he wrote a textbook called Theory of Constraints, but he knew that people weren't going to sit down and read his textbook. So he wrote a novel, The Goal, about somebody who had a problem and how they overcame that problem, and illustrating the application of theory of constraints. He didn't get all of theory of constraints in The Goal, so he followed it up with another book called It's Not Luck, which continues the story, and then a third book called Critical Chain, which mostly handles projects. And we'll come back to projects in addiction in just a little bit. But Everyone here who is dealing with addiction is facing a number of problems that seem insolvable. It may be a really complex patient. It may be the refusal of someone to pay for care. It may be getting parts of our organization to talk to other parts of our organization. But there are a number of problems that face us in addiction. It may be that the government doesn't do the right thing with laws that help us do the treatment, or that you see other people doing things that are making our patients worse. Regardless of the problem, though, Goldratt gave us a set of tools that we can use to solve really any problem we have in addiction. But before I tell you those tools and how we use them, I need to just talk about nature a little bit. Because he came at this as a physicist, and he had a physicist's view of nature. He understood nature as a series of sequential steps. That's how a physicist would view the universe. One thing happens after another, and each thing is dependent on the thing that came before. And he saw that all human activity was that same way. Now, there are examples of non-sequential action in nature. We look at those as parallel. And here's a way to look at parallel processes, and we have to cover those before we can look at Goldratt's sequential process. In a parallel process, there are very simple rules, multiple iterations. The individuals don't matter. There are many, many, many of them. They're completely interchangeable, and they work in parallel regardless of what happens, and if something goes wrong, they just redo it. This was actually handled very well in a book out of MIT called Turtles, Termites, and Traffic Jams by Mitchell Resnick. And he describes how so much of the natural world is parallel. Here's an example of a parallel process, a termite mound. It's a huge construction. And it's not only a huge construction, but if you cut it open, it seems remarkably well designed. The inside of a termite mound, each one's going to be slightly different, but everyone's going to have all the same parts in all the same places. They all have a central ventilation shaft, multiple chimneys. They all have fungus combs on top of the nursery galleries and a royal cell at the bottom. Every one of them has the same rooms, almost as if the same architect planned every termite colony. But really, it's billions of termites following 3 simple rules. If it's 5 degrees colder than ground level, don't build here. If there are a lot of termites here already, turn 90 degrees. If it's not cooler than ground level, remove some material from the wall. With those 3 rules, and only those 3 rules, and a billion termites, you get a termite mound. Same kind of thing with birds flying in a pattern. Just 3 rules. Avoid crowding your neighbors, steer toward the average heading, and steer toward the average position of your neighbors. So if you took not birds, but programmable buggies, and you gave them those 3 rules, they would form a delta, just like flying birds do. And trees growing. Again, just 3 variables. They have a branch angle, the width before auto pruning, and the branch length before secondary branching. You plug those 3 variables in, you get a pine tree. Different 3 variables, you get an oak tree. What makes different trees look different are those 3 variables. But all 3 of these examples are just natural phenomena. Here's what's different about sequential events. Sequence is a complex of simple logical steps in a critical sequential order. Everything has to be in the right order. And why we do something is the most important question. Individuals are very important, and we can produce amazing structures at very low cost during action, but higher cost at planning. So with parallel, there's no planning, and you can create incredible things, but there's a high cost of action because you have a lot of rework. In sequential, there's very little rework, but an awful lot of work in the planning on the front end. And this would be best outlined in Goldratt's book, Theory of Constraints. An example would be a factory line. If you were going to buy a car, I'm going to bet you don't want them to put the parts together in the wrong order. If you were going to have chest pain evaluated in the ER, you'd want them to follow an order. If someone was going to pick which bariatric surgery to do, you'd want them to follow a known algorithm, which is essentially in order. And so all the parallel examples were out of nature, and all the sequential examples were human action, human constructions, things we engineered, things we decided to do. And we have a kind of a rift in our field. We like, at many levels, we like the idea of parallel action. If you think how many of us learned to do treatment, there was treatment in a group, in a residential setting with a bunch of people, and we were going to produce a curriculum and give that curriculum to this bunch of people, and it was repeated over and over again. They all got little bits of it. Maybe Bob learned something today, maybe Sally didn't learn something today, maybe Bob didn't learn anything tomorrow, then Sally learned something. And we didn't understand what order people got things in. We just repeated the same thing over and over, and some people got it, some people didn't. And then if they didn't get it at the end of treatment, they recycled through, hopefully, after they hit a new bottom, and we repeated the process over and over again. So all of us, whether we know it or not, or think of it or not, we were exposed to a parallel idea of treating addiction. Sort of the throw enough mud against the wall and some of it sticks school. Now, I'm not trying to belittle things, that there was, of course, refinements on that, but if you look at the base, there was not anyone, from that model, there was not anyone saying, Bob is different than Jane, Bob doesn't need to go to group today because we're going to talk about anger, and he doesn't need to be hearing about anger. Instead, he should go sit over there and do something else while we talk to everybody else who needs anger group. It was all, everybody got the same thing, which is a very parallel process. So what is theory of constraints? He started writing it down in the 1980s. He wrote those texts, but he also wrote the 3 novels, which are very easy to read. And if you could read through those 3 novels, you would essentially have the feel of TOC. If you wanted to use it, you'd probably want to read more, and there are practice things on the internet. There's a lot of things to find and a lot of resources. But if you read those, that would be enough to really understand what you could do with TOC.